All right, so we should be live now. So tonight I'm doing something a little bit different. I have somebody on who's just a friend in real life, an older friend of the family, I'll say. He's, for the purpose of this stream, I'll call him Father David. And I met him over the break and we were discussing various things about the culture and the future. And we discussed doing a live stream, and this seemed to be a good night as any to do it. I've recently did a vlog about sort of the future of young people, and by that matter, the rest of the world. And actually, it's sort of funny because when I originally started the channel, I used to do live streams all the time with just like, oh, hey, I know in real life, let's just talk about politics on my YouTube channel. And then slowly, as I did, as I got sort of more, I hate the word clout, but as I sort of grew the channel, I started getting more and more. Excuse me. Pardon me. I accidentally killed my own window. Father, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. More and more clout, and then you cut out.
All right. So yeah, I'm sorry. I have too many windows open, and this just sort of become a total disaster. So I guess what I wanted to kind of go on is that I just wanted to sort of open the channel up to have more impromptu conversations. And this seemed to be a good way as any to do it. So I guess I'll just sort of open it up and have you introduce yourself, Father. We're going to call you Father Dave in this channel.
Sure.
And
Sure.
And that will be sort of a weird thing because everyone calls me Dave here as well. So.
Well, yeah, so I'll go by Father David. And I am a Catholic priest, and I'm affiliated with Dave and family and such. And yeah, so we did have a great opportunity to kind of meet and have a conversation. And I'm presently enjoying a vacation right now. And I just said, well, if you want to get together and have a conversation, I'll be happy to do it because my schedule is free. Thanks be to God. So it just seemed like a perfect time as any.
Yeah. I mean, people always. This is something that I think we need to do a lot more. Is there's sort of the internet sphere that we've been stuck in for the last 2 years, and then there is the personal one. I'm kind of trying to break down the barriers a little bit. It's difficult because I don't know. The problem is the current political climate makes it sort of impossible. There's always guilt by association things, and you talk about controversial topics online, and it's just so easy to indict people. And this has just been a serious problem.
Well, one of the reasons why I'm kind of going by a pseudonym is one of the things that can often happen to a priest when he talks about these issues and when theology intersects with politics is that people always tell the priest, oh, well, stop talking about politics. And in my estimation, I want nothing to do with politics. I find it, no disrespect or anything, but I find it kind of boring. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, religious life should intersect with politics. So one of the reasons why I don't necessarily want my name getting out there is not because I'm ashamed of my opinions or anything like that, but it's primarily because I don't want to alienate parishioners on either side of a political spectrum when they would start thinking that my political views are theological or vice versa. So I kind of like hanging out in the darkness just because sometimes things can be so heavily laden that I just want to be able to say to people, you matter more than your politics.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the problem is that everything has become politicized, right? And it's there's not actually. It's funny because I talk to a lot about people who sort of talk about descriptively realistic politics. And that's not really what people want to do when they're doing politics these days. What they want to do right now is they want to have a religion. They want to just basically have a community of like moral people. And so that's what most of these political stances are. And, you know, that's sort of what a lot of the danger we've fallen into right now is just like everything has become political, and there's really no way out of it, because, well, I mean, I think this is sort of, we talk a lot about in this channel is just, you know, the way people have gone right now is they've kind of become so narcissistically involved in their own political stances that they can't even live their lives anymore. And the last 2 years haven't helped this process at all.
Not one bit. Well, one of the things that, so I happen to be an adult convert. And one of the things that actually drew me to living the life of the faith was I was involved in politics at a time. And what started to scare me was that the political landscape where I was from was turning increasingly religious. And it felt weird, and I couldn't put it into words. And I was only an undergrad at the time, so I couldn't quite figure out what the issue was. But it was not until that I studied the Middle Ages, and then I learned about the what's called the investiture conflict and the gradual distinction of the spiritual and the temporal powers of the Middle Ages, either popes and kings, or bishops and kings. And then I was like, oh, like it was a great miracle in the Christian world to say that a king shouldn't have the powers of a bishop and that a bishop shouldn't have the powers of a king. Because then when you look around the world, politics is religion, right? Like when Julius Caesar does his thing, he's acting as a priest. There's always de facto priestly roles and religious roles in almost every government, except in the Christian world. And that was actually one of the initial attractions for me, was that then if I became a priest, I could say to, you know, with almost that kind of disdain that Jesus says about the coin, you know, just keep your coin, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And I just found that to be so incredibly liberating. But then now what I'm watching in the political world, and especially also in the religious world, is because people have forgotten about that distinction. It's almost like this pagan reunification of politics and religion is happening. And I find that profoundly disturbing.
Well, it's sort of funny because when I listen to you talk, I know you're not really involved in sort of this side of political thought, but like this is exactly the conclusions that people who are sort of who read the kind of books that I do and my friends do come to, is that we're essentially, we gave up our kings and now we're essentially ruled by a Brahmin cult. Yes. And this Brahmin cult is doing what Brahmins always do, which is essentially creating a moral supercaste of people that have privileges and wield powers obscured behind a layer of ideology, such that their actions are never accountable and are never transparent. And everyone else just has to hope that this class of Brahmins feels vindicated enough. And what's sort of strangely, I mean, the problem with the reason why the aristocrat and the king is in many ways better than the Brahmin, as we're discovering right now, A, is that the aristocrats are sort of transparent. B, is that the aristocrats have sort of skin in the game. They are of one people with the people they rule over. But at the same time that they sort of have similar interests, broadly speaking, obviously there's limits to that. The king and the peasants don't have the exact same interests, but there is some connection. There's a noblesse oblige. But the third reason, and what I'm increasingly appreciating more about the classical Christian way of managing power, is the separation. And that is that a lot of political action that we're experiencing right now, it exists only to feed the narcissism of the political class and the cultural class. It exists to give them a reason to lecture us. Like masks is a perfect example, right? I mean, like you know, we can't really comment on the effectiveness of them because that's not legal on YouTube, and that's not really the point. The point is that the enforcement is completely disconnected from their effectiveness as a preventative measure, to the extent it exists. It's basically a way, and there's many ways that this is happening. this is that basically what should be sort of a neutral civic question is transformed into a political narcissistic question for purposes of manufacturing meaning in a class of ignoble aristocrats that have no religion themselves and only understand religious moments through their own ego.
Well, one of the things that you could see this problem developing in the Catholic world for a while, and I'm talking centuries, when people would just kind of assume that Catholic teaching could be determined by fiat rather than by watching the development of doctrine from the apostolic age until the present day, whenever that present day happened to have been. Because the people would say, well, why can't the Pope just change a teaching? It's like, no, he can't, because it's not his. And one of the things about, orthodoxy kind of gets a bad word. Like I've heard a lot of bloggers talk right now about the orthodoxy of the modern the political Brahmins that use the expression you already used. But one of the nice things about an actual religious orthodoxy is that when the authorities are acting against the faith that is, for instance, revealed in Christ, I can say, see, I can tell you exactly where you screwed up, right? Like I can draw a line and then make a connection and say, this is the orthodoxy. And so then even the powerful can be held accountable to that orthodoxy. But the present orthodoxy is an evil one because it's indeterminate. It's basically the moods of the popular. And that's a really terrifying orthodoxy to live under, because it's like living, like as you point out, it's like living in a narcissistic father's home who will pull off his belt if he's feeling bad from work, not necessarily because of anything he's done. So then what that does is that stymies any kind of freedom, any kind of joy, any kind of initiative on the part of the people. And that's another thing that can be incredibly concerning. Whereas one of the things that I enjoy about being a priest that actually professes and believes the faith, I can act like a wild, crazy person on one level, but at another level, if I can explain and justify everything that I'm doing in the faith, then even the authorities, in a sense, they could, but they can't go after me. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? Like I'll be able to at least mount a defense. But those that get under the trials of Hollywood types or the academe or of YouTube, like I'm pretty sure as a streamer yourself, trying to figure out what will get you banned or shadow banned or anything like that is probably a bloody nightmare.
Yeah, I guess I always, whenever someone calls me a streamer, I'm like, I'm not a streamer, I'm a video essayist. There was this, Father, I have to tell you this, there was this, in the history of YouTube, there was sort of this transition between when people wrote essays out and then read them, to make videos, and then when people just let it continuously stream and do stream of consciousness. And I've always been more in the more old school camp. And the later thing is just to have like these endless streams, especially about politics. And the emergence of Twitch streaming really encouraged that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The religion has a certain amount of dignity to it when it's sort of professed on your sleeve. And this is sort of, I guess, one thing I sort of recommend to a lot of people or a lot of younger people. And I recently wrote an essay about Zoomers and things that I think will help them and won't help them. And I'm sure I'll be discussing this with a lot of people for probably the rest of the year. But one thing I didn't mention in the essay was I think it's very important to have a certain amount of sincerity about what you believe in and really what you are. There's so many opportunities to sort of hide people's beliefs under vague platitudes.
Yep.
And just sort of being who you are and an authentic person. That when I was a young person, I thought authenticity was sort of a scam. But now more and more, I'm realizing that there's just this, that's really where you need to be. You just need to be very, very earnest about where you are and what you believe in, and don't apologize for it. And that's where the strength, I think you can kind of find your center in that in a lot of ways. And social media has just done this horrifically disrupted this, because now all we care about is sort of the simulacrum of the thing as it exists on social media.
Yeah.
So, that's a problem. And again, what are you going to do to young people? They've been cut off from most social engagements for 2 years now. You tell them to go back to how it was in 2003. It's going to be very, very difficult.
In a sense, you can never go back, and I don't mean these words, but on one level, a lot of the things that were coming really, really slowly. And if the pandemic has done anything, is that it's accelerated some of the problems so that you can see them in relief. It's almost like somebody, the frog inside the pot, the heat got really fast. The heat got higher faster. And for that, I'm mildly grateful, because there has been a bit more attention paid to some of these questions. But then the sad thing is that the acrimony that's been attached to it has increased. So the problem and the plight of young people today, I believe that these problems were going to hit no matter what happened, because I think that a lot of our present struggles have been brewing for the several decades, or even for the last century. So I'm kind of happy that this happened the way it did, but I don't mean those words.
Well, I mean, the problem with the frog in the pot analogy is that they accelerated the temperature and the frog didn't jump out of the pot. The best we can say right now is that there's this vague understanding that things can't go on the way they've been going on. There's this vague suspicion that maybe we can't keep on doing things like this. Maybe we can't live our lives through an Instagram feed. That's not possible. Or maybe we can't have a completely bonkers political order that is based on pure vindication. This is all, I mean, again, this is stuff we talked about a lot on this channel, but this is something that is acutely aware and is sort of a lived reality for myself and most people who are in the sphere. We can't keep on living like this. We can't keep on living like this. That was a title from a movie that came out in the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev administration, saying we can't keep living like this. They're sort of the first to tell the honesty about the bread lines and all that stuff. And it was a big splash, and one of the things that almost maybe did contribute to the eventual fall of the Soviet Union. And that's sort of echoing day after day that things just have to change to be sustainable. But then you look at the rest of the world, and very few people believe this. Very few people, they're all concerned about how to jockey for status in this declining society. And no one's even talking about how to fix it. I see my friend Franklin in the chat. He's an expat who spent a lot of time in the East, the Far East. Well, he's Australian himself, but there's this line that he quoted from another Chinese person looking at Western society that's sort of stuck in my mind. And that quote was, this is something that I've heard in various forms from a lot of people who come from Taiwan or China, Chinese culture, broadly speaking. And they said, everything in the West is about politics, but nothing ever gets done. How can you always talk about politics? Everything is about who's up, who's down, what's the next thing, but nothing ever gets done to materially confront the problems. And this is absolutely true, and this is sort of where we are right now.
Well, I think that the reason why everything is politics and nothing gets done goes, in a sense, to what I was saying at the very beginning, is that our political problems are not political problems. They're religious problems. We just haven't faced them. And we're doing everything we can to not face them. One of those things that often strikes me as absolutely hilarious is, contrary to when I was a young person, not that I'm tremendously old, but I'm young, and I'm old enough. But when I was a younger person, everybody was absolutely convinced that religion and evolution and science and all these things were absolutely at odds with each other. And given time, it's proven to be, that was just a nonsense theory, just absolute nonsense. And it was known to be nonsense. And when I was becoming Catholic, one of those things that struck me as so strange was that the intensity with which people would do what they could to not think about religious questions. That proved to me to be very, very striking. All you need to do is to go on a I'm going to tease you a little bit. Go back with some of your streamer buddies, right? high flying internet personalities, and then you say, "Is this a religious problem?" They will buckle. Look at their eyes, and
Well, that's
it's
the problem.
almost as if
all of the people live stream would say it's a religious problem. Even the atheists would at this stage. Like, someone who was mentioned before we went live was a YouTuber called Carl Benjamin or Sargon of Akkad. He was a new atheist, and now he's like, I hope Christianity comes back, because he understands that this is that we're just getting devoured by a puritanical cult that's rushed into the vacuum created by secularism. Like, this is just it's I don't know, like, it just feels like, again, this is sort of the separation between myself and the rest of the world. I think, like, we're really acutely aware of this. I think what's the thing that's, I'm looking back on my own history, like, I guess what's changed with me is that when I started the channel, I was kind of like in this very John Paul II mode. Like, we basically have the solution, and the solution is to kind of create this space where the full magisterium of the Catholic Church coexists with modernity. And it's not that I don't believe in anything that I'm a huge John Paul II fan, and I think the man was a saint, and I think his vision was beautiful, but I don't think it's going to come to pass, because the new religious order is just so hostile to everything, and it's so absolutely desperate that it's going to come to head in some very explosive way. And so in that light, it's there's this, people make fun of me. There's this stream early on I did where I said I'm a committed Catholic liberal, and people they make fun of me for this, because my entire career after that was just like basically taking it to the Enlightenment. and so like and so like it's so funny that like the first one I ever did was me defending liberalism, and it's just because it sort of disabused me of this whole notion that what were we experiencing for the last 200 years as the West slowly became religious? The narrative is that we became less religious, but did we? Or did the religion just move into some kind of weird direction, right? And moved into some kind of weird nationalist, weird secularist direction, where the same religious impulses were simply obscured behind political forces that are now moving, metastasizing into some kind of weird puritanical cult.
Well, this I will address more as a pastor of a parish. So that's my primary role. And when I look at people, one of the things that I have to do is there's the Catholic faith, and then there's what I call the Catholic religions. So I do not consider the Catholic Church to be a religion. I consider it to be a collection of religions that point to a single faith. Because the religions are a series of customs, practices that tether you and help you imitate an ideal, or help you imitate something that you want to participate in. But then the mystery is that it's not so much about your practices that bring you closer to that. It's actually how the mystery descends into your life. It's a complete inversion of our religious expectations. But you do need to open the door sufficiently so as to welcome that mystery in. So as a pastor, one of my jobs is then to look at the people, their tendencies, their preferences, and oftentimes their unconscious ideological frameworks, and then try to give them a series of customs and practices that actually order their lives towards what we would call the Catholic faith. But then what I also need to do is to pre-program in advance inside the community when those religious customs fail. I have to do both. So I have to do a bunch of things that tether them to a sense of meaning and purpose. And then I need to prepare them for when all of their sense of meaning and purpose completely collapse. So I see this, for instance, in two times. First is baptisms and in marriages. And it's basic, like when I do a marriage now, I almost always give the same homily, which is God bless you as you begin this beautiful life, but you're idiots. You have no idea what the hell you're doing.
Well, I listened to one of your homilies. It was very good. I'm trying to recall it now, right?
But
I like the
that's
aggressive
basically
element.
well, I am aggressive, but that's
Yeah.
effectively the
That's
thrust of it. Like, you
refreshing,
go,
though.
so when somebody comes into a church and they say, "I believe in God the Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth," I just go, "No, you don't. No, you don't," because the God the Father Almighty, Creator of heaven and earth, exists outside the framework that is creation. God created that framework to give you a way of talking about Him, but then you have to let that go. So in the last few centuries, one of the things that we've been dealing with profoundly is we want to do two things at once. We want to eat our cake and have it, which is we want to be able to believe that our ideas about the divine actually have substance, and we want to be able to have the elasticity that doubt can give us, right? So like the wiggle room, when somebody else is certain about their dogma, then you can be able to say, well, wait a second, right? And so when I'm acting as a pastor and trying to do those two things, I'm actually trying to prevent a war of one person's certainty conflicting with another person's legitimate doubt, and that person's legitimate doubt completely not destroying the other person's certainty, and then teaching them how to live together. And so to build and to advance is to say, oh, you young couple, you're about to get married and you love each other right now. Wait a while. Because that's not what love is all about. Like, when love really kicks in is when you look at this person and you think, ugh, okay, I love you, honey. You know, how can I help you? Like, it's those moments where it actually kicks in. So the postmodern project, the project that we're in right now, is how do you live in a time of complete social, political, and religious uncertainty and act with confidence and fearlessness? You need to do both. And what I'm finding in a lot of public religious debates is that they're only picking one side, or they're trying to keep all the good stuff for their faction and then throw all the dregs to somebody else, where I think it's the exact opposite. You should be willing to take the challenge for yourself so that you can make somebody else better off. And so when I became a priest, when I decided I wanted to become a priest, it was actually a retreat from the world. By that time, I was already thoroughly entrenched in the pessimism of growing up listening to, Nirvana and all that stuff. And the idea was, well, is there anything out there in the world that can make things better? And honestly, my answer was no. But my thought was, well, if I live my faith authentically, even if I'm living in the abyss of nothing, it's not nothing, because God will find me there. I don't need to coerce Him. I just need to be faithful to let Him find me. And that was one of those John Paul II things. That I think he was really good at, but I don't think he got credit for.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of people are looking for some kind of exit to the modern world. I think that's something. I don't know. I guess the problem is there's a skepticism that kind of the exit that people want. How possible is it, right? People want to leave the world, yeah, and I mean, I don't know. It's difficult, right? I'm not saying I found a solution to this yet, but it when you're looking at how the world's going.
Okay. One of my favorite stories was written by a non-Catholic. It's the Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald.
Yeah, George MacDonald.
He was one of the
influences on C.S. Lewis and the rest of sort of the
and Chesterton and the whole gamut. Yeah, and he wrote this. He has some sermons too that changed my life. You can find them. It's called "Getting to Know Jesus," but the fairy tale is called "The Princess and the Goblin," and it's about this little girl, and she finds her fairy godmother, and then her fairy godmother says, "I'm going to give you a ring that has this long string that I've made just for you, this long thread I made just for you. That if you ever get lost, it will guide you back home." And a part of the story is that she does get lost. She does find herself in danger, and she decides to obediently follow this string, and it leads her to the cavern of the antagonist, these goblins, and she's utterly terrified throughout the whole thing. But the magic of her story, the magic of the princess, and the magic of all of George MacDonald's work is that day-to-day trust that God is actually alive. And this is where a lot of annoying religiosity kicks in, where people confuse certainty and self-certainty with faith, which is nonsense. Like, by definition, the word faith means uncertainty.
Yes.
So if you're going through a journey and then you feel comfortable, well, that's great, but that's not faith, buddy. So the story of the girl, the princess, going through the cave and being led by a thread, and then feels afraid and lonely, and even maybe that her fairy godmother has abandoned her, but she trusts in the fairy godmother more than she trusts in her fears. That's the kind of meaning of it.
Well, I mean, to translate this into sort of like the to translate this to people who aren't Catholic, a lot of people, when we talk about, say, for instance, the future and our declining society, the only way out of this situation might be just to take this on the chin and walk right into whatever we're experiencing, and put faith into the fact that something we value and love will come out on the other side. I by no means mean giving into it, but it does mean just saying we can't stop these forces that are going into effect right now. What we're fighting for is some kind of hope at the end of the tunnel, rather than any kind of prevention going into the tunnel.
Yeah. Like,
that's hard because we have no ability to visualize what's going to be on the opposite side.
No, and you can't. And by definition, too, if the end is God, not some political or religious utopia, by definition, it's not knowable. Right? Like, that's why one of the fundamental early Christian understandings is that the whole point of God coming among human beings is that human beings can become like God. So even the scriptures are ambivalent about trying to describe what our redemption would look like. Right? The descriptions of the resurrected body of Jesus are very, very vague. One of my favorite readings is from the first letter of John. It says, "Beloved, see what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God, and that is what we are. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed." It's basically him saying, like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, that's the apostle that wrote the book of Revelation, apparently. And yet he's just straight up saying, I have no idea how this is going to turn out. So part of me would like, not saying that I'm saying this to Mr. Akkad or anything like that, but if you want Christianity to pick it up, well, go to church, sit in the back, see what happens.
Well, it's sort of funny because you said, this isn't a private conversation, but I remember hearing something.
I try to not see all these people.
Yeah. I remember you saying something that was very similar to a conclusion I came to a while back, which is that apologetics is kind of useless. And, this is something like, I was a new atheist. I don't want to be a hipster, but I was a new atheist before it became really cool. I kind of caught the front end of the sort of Dawkins and Hitchens thing. So the second Dawkins and Hitchens sort of came in, I was already kind of on my way out of atheism. That's how it worked. But I was still sort of like, there was this time when I was a fan of Hitchens because he's got a really delectable writing style. He was an amazing insult comedian. I don't know if that's still a thing, but there were a lot of like insult poets back in the day, and Hitchens is very much in that tradition. I was, when I moved to Christianity, I became really into apologetics and watching all the debates. And I think when I started the channel, I was kind of getting out of that mode because it was obvious, and I guess this should have been obvious a lot sooner, that what would happen was that a new atheist like Christopher Hitchens would show up to a debate with someone like William Lane Craig or somebody, and they weren't even having the same conversation. Like, the new atheists weren't interested in a metaphysical question. They wanted to convince themselves that once we got rid of religion, the world would be perfect. And the conversation was, it was basically like one person showed up for, an indictment hearing and the other person showed up for an academic debate, and it was just absolutely useless.
Mm-hmm.
And apologetics kind of faded out, and probably they're now at an all-time low because nobody's debating religion anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when I look at people who've left behind progressivism, who left behind the vision of the city of man, I don't wonder if apologetics was just, our obsession with apologetics was just misplaced. I don't know. Would somebody, and I'm really thinking about Europeans. There seem to be so many Europeans that are kind of orbiting around Christianity, but because of Europe's relationship with the faith in the 20th century, something really stops them from embracing it as a living
Mm-hmm.
creed. They're always sort of a step away.
Well, remember a lot of the problems of Europe's relationship with Christianity in the 20th century, I think, have the same root, which is we would love to be able to have a domesticated gospel, and one in which, for instance, God is under control, life is under control, but it's not. Like, I think that the delusion of control was much more dangerous in the early 20th century than it is now. We have more instruments of control, but now it's abundantly clear that all those that have the technology to control the world are too incompetent to even try. And I think the long-term question, and the reason why I never liked apologetics is, and we have a distinction sometimes in pastoral works in the Catholic Church, which is the distinction between catechesis and evangelization. We're not evangelized. Evangelization means here is a beautiful and arresting encounter with a person who is beyond your understanding. And yet, once you've met him, then you get to know him. But this is another George MacDonald thing, right? Where he says that we spend all of our time trying to get to know about him, but not him himself. And that's huge, right? And if there's anything that we can be prone to in today's Twitter world, is learning data about a person, creating a simulacrum as you're describing, and then thinking we're in a relationship. It's just bunk. It's just bunk.
Well, I mean, that's, this is sort of, I've kind of come back to reading the Bible more, starting in the Old Testament, and I found that to be incredibly fresh. I don't know if this is neither here nor there. I'm kind of thinking of someone like William Lane Craig from the old days. He could prattle off the cosmological argument in no time flat and make 4 arguments for it, and he know all the refutations, and it was just really soulless. And now I'm coming back to sort of, other of my friends who are reading the Bible. There's one channel called Lambda Reads the Bible, I think is what his channel is called. And I'm really appreciating just his very sincere takes on scripture and just reading through that in a different mode. And it's just something that's really, really refreshing. And I don't know if you necessarily needs to be, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is your opinion. I mean, faith formation is kind of a tricky thing. I wouldn't imagine that a lot of people who aren't Christian would really appreciate that. Oh, I've been told that Father David just dropped. Okay. We can wait for him to add back in. Oh, all right. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
No problem. How much did you miss?
I heard that you said something about non-Catholics not appreciating something.
Well, I guess to repeat myself, I was just speculating on, I mean, you were talking about how we can actually come to know God, which is, that's a very tall order. I don't know if anybody who's not on the verge of death, like you were saying that, like, who knows who actually really believes in God? Well,
yeah,
that's a tricky topic because I'm not so sure. Like, I intellectually always say that my belief in God intellectually speaking, not any given miracle, but just God as a concept is pretty much 100%. But do I believe it? Like really? I think that, if you're not on the verge of death, it's very, very hard to have an emotional belief in something
Well,
that
and
large, I
emotional
guess.
beliefs are pretty small. Like, 'cause one of the blessings of my vocation is I get to see a lot of people at the frame of death. And one of the things that it's taught me is that the will is a function of the soul just as much as anything else, and just as much as the body and the mind. And just as the body can be weak, so can the will and the mind. And so a person can, I would say their belief can't be measured by any mortal. Only God knows that. And all a religious group needs to do is just to give people the space, in a sense, to open the door in their own way without kind of pushing it too much. If you know what I mean? Like, what most people would consider religious and happy religion would make me want to barf. Because I'm not religious in that sense. I came to the faith through a study of history and philosophy, and then I saw it as a necessary first principle. And then I realized that that first principle loved me. You see, there's a difference, right? So everybody's attracted on a certain wavelength, and then that wavelength dies, and then they're transformed as they respond to it.
Oh, sorry, Father, I was muted, so you couldn't hear me nodding in agreement. But yeah, I agree
Okay.
with that. Yeah, I mean, it's something that firsthand experiences are not our generation's strong suit. I'll say that, right?
Yeah.
So if you're telling me, like, this is always the thing, and I've been very clear about this, that I've never really had a strong religious experience. I've had other
Yep.
people tell me about their religious experiences, and that's almost kind of been like a religious experience, but I've never had some kind of Paul getting knocked off his horse on the way to Damascus type thing. That's never been part of my experience. And so, I guess this is always a challenge. And this is, one of my favorite writers, people give me crap for quoting him too much, but is a person called Curtis Yarvin, who wrote a blog back in 2008 that I explained a lot. And one thing he said recently that stuck with me was, in order for things to actually change, someone around here is going to need to start a cult, but it's just not going to be me. And to paraphrase that, for anything to change around here, someone's going to have to be a living saint, and it's not going to be me. I don't know, right? I think we should all strive for small s sainthood, but it's just, and it feels strange because, historically speaking, I know something is going to have to change radically, and people are going to have to be doing things quite differently. But
Well,
I
maybe
can start that a little bit, but there's just such a difference between what any of us are capable of and the kind of leaps that I think everyone's increasingly seeing as necessary.
Well, one of the differences between, like, one of the fundamental characteristics of Christian sanctity is that it's hidden, that it's humble, and it's ordinary. Like, that's one of those Chestertonian things, that God loves simple and common things. Whereas we often are looking for saints, or those people that will be able to repeat the water into wine kind of thing, or to do multiple healings. Like, for you as a married man, your principal means of holiness is to love your wife, to be faithful, to love her until the end of your lives, and to be faithful in terms of handing on your faith to your children. Like, that's ultimately the principal source of holiness for you. And then it all builds on top of that. Whereas oftentimes we're looking for a kind of holiness that's flashy. So it's almost like when the Gospels begin, and when Jesus begins his public declaration of being of the kingdom of God. On one level, he does the great signs, but then he also has this dismissive character towards the signs themselves, where what he considers to be the most important thing is trust in God, right? Like, when he hears the centurion say, no, you don't need to come to my home, just say the word. That blows Jesus away. Whereas, three loaves, two fish, who cares? Miracle, there, boom, moving on almost. So I think that part of the issue is that we don't see how we see the world is framed by our values, and we have not even begun to value what God values, let alone being able to act on it. And so this is why I think love of the poor, humility, mercy, prayer are so important, because we all think that we should be doing something more important. It's like, no, God's got this. God's got the world. Relax. Do your thing. And when you see a lot of the great saints, the ones that do the miracles, they say this very thing, right? I forget, it was either St. Bonaventure or St. Francis. There's one of those Franciscan dudes from the 13th century. When asked, what would you do if it was the end of the world, and if it was the end of the world right now, what would you start doing? And he said, well, I'd finish doing the dishes.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
that is sort of what I think we've lost, is sort of a God of the small things.
Yeah. Sorry to say. Yeah.
I know I'm very notoriously not the best person with details, and so that's always very difficult for me. And
well, then you do think so. You do, but you do those great small things with great love. So, like I mentioned, I'm on vacation right now. I'm visiting a friend, and he's much more detail oriented than myself. So, the way he cleans the coffee maker, the way he lays it all out. And we were driving the Mass this morning, and he said he just wanted to gently remind me to push my seat in after I'm done breakfast. I'm like, okay, good to know. And then I tried to repeat to myself throughout the course of the day, make sure you do these things for this guy who can't imagine a world where this is not important, and I can't imagine a world where it is important. And somehow by charity, it'll work itself out. And the fact that this guy and I are friends is a bloody miracle.
yeah, I think is he I have a question. Is he of our generation, or is he a young
Yes.
person, or is he older?
He's a young
of our
priest like
generation.
me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to find young people that are sort of highly conscientious and highly detail oriented these days. It seems to be, maybe they're just a lot less loud than outspoken people like us. Right. But
well, true enough. But one of the cool things, so when I was in the seminary, which is a place for training priests, is that they wedge all the guys that are thinking of the priesthood in one place. And you have nothing to join you except for a common vocational desire. Right? And so all these guys, they're like, okay, I want to be a priest. And then this other guy, he's really punctilious. There's one person who's quite scholarly. There's another person who's not scholarly. He's an athlete. There's another guy that does this. There's another guy that just wants to spend all his time hunting. There's blah, 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 blah. But then the funny thing is that a bond is created among them that kind of helps them, so that, because what happens this is one of the reasons why church is so essential for Christian life. It's not optional, because you have to be drawn into great contact with people that under any other circumstance you wouldn't have wasted your time with.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, I am with this person because we are going to Jesus together, and then Jesus has brought us together. Whereas one of those great dangers of a lot of church life today is, unless you're of my political persuasion, unless you're of my social or religious or ethnic persuasion, you are not on my team. Whereas being a Catholic priest in North America right now is awesome, because you get to have an experience of all these different cultures, all these different communities that want you to be a part of their life. And so you get a really broad spectrum of what's going on inside the human world. And then the benefit is that I also have friends that, like I said, under any other circumstance would not be my friend.
Well, this is what a lot of people have said recently, is that their entire culture right now is focused around your identity being a product of choice, and really sort of a very superficial choice. But at the same time, there's this generational desire for deep relationships. But the difficulty is that there can't be deep relationships when all of the relationships exist under the banner of pure prerogative, without a binding of obligation. Everything is just temporal and collapses in on itself.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, who knows what the result is, but I think people need to, I mean, at least bind themselves to ideas and principles. I think that
It's a good starting point.
yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't know what the alternative would be. I mean, it seems to me that a big coming of age is binding yourself to something by an oath. That can be marriage, that can be a priesthood, maybe even more temporarily, something like the military. But without those experiences, with everything being transactional or, again, discretional,
Mm-hmm.
this is something that it's creating, like, for instance, people make their best friends in high school, and
Mm-hmm.
increasingly sometimes in college, but actually much less rarely. And why is that? Well, it's because you're all forced together and you all have this commonality of experience.
Mm-hmm.
College, there's no commonality of experience, and in the workplace, even less so.
Mm-hmm.
There's this show. Do you ever know The Office? This
Of
is a
course.
sort of a cultural artifact, and I'm surprised it has such a long life. I think when people talk about The Office, they mostly mean the American one, but there's a British one, and people, I think it's a little bit different. But the American Office,
Yes, it does. Yeah.
yeah. So what's so odd about this is it was sort of a mediocre show. It was a good show. I watched it back when I still watched television. This was around 2009, I think. That was sort of its high watermark.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with The Office was that it was funny, but it wasn't really funny. And it was certainly not something that stood the test of time like a lot of other comedy shows I could mention from the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But I was surprised to see recently that this is that, and also I should say in the 2000s, it was kind of considered what we would call cringe comedy, or it was sort of like a bad workplace and everyone hates their boss. And this is
Yeah.
like the thing. But now people are watching The Office uh, almost with a nostalgia factor to it. Like,
Yeah.
isn't it so fun to be part of this office? And the reason is not because it's such great work. They're all just pushing paper or doing meaningless work. But
Yeah.
the reason why people are so enthralled by The Office is that this is a place where everyone's kind of forced into a pseudo camaraderie, uh,
Yeah.
brought on by their boss's buffoonishness.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
people don't have that. People have offices that are much more political, and they don't have the kind of camaraderie brought on by the situation. So the same thing that was in 2009 supposed to be cringe comedy, oh, how horrible is this workplace, it is now
Mm-hmm.
almost looked back on with sort of wistfulness.
Well, I think there's a dimension of that era of sitcoms. So there's The Office and there's also Community, the show Community. Um,
Yeah.
and both of them have this notion of the person who has no home elsewhere, and so they make their home here. So either it's community college or it's the office itself. And then you kind of watch at the end of end of the series when you kind of see what happens when the whole person's life is revolved around the office or the school.
Mhm.
I find it both touching and sad because on one level, you are met. Community begins when you're at your most vulnerable. And I think this is why people are so lonely today, right? So the whole
Mhm.
premise of community is that we're outcasts. Nobody else wanted us, but we found each other. In the office, it's more or less the same. Who'd really want to be Dwight's friend, you know? But well, I'm going the American one, right? But who would really
No,
want?
I think
And
that's the one I don't know.
David Brandon and Michael Scott are both tremendously pathetic individuals that are looking for affirmation.
Mhm.
And the one thing that they can't do is to just be weak. You see moments of it every now and again, but they're not really good at it.
I mean,
And
they're petty tyrants because they have no
exactly,
community,
and
right?
and like most narcissists, petty tyrants because they're afraid. And yet, that's I find to be the singular need of the singular courage of the world today is not to be that kind of person that goes and tells it to the man. I am so tired of those people. The real
Mhm.
courage that we need today is to sit down and shut up and listen to people, you know,
Mhm.
and to just be able, like, and it's a skill you practice in prayer, by the way. Like every morning, I spend an hour in prayer before God. It's my job as a priest, but it's also my joy to do. And I've been doing it long before I became a priest, because that's that one place. And that place is anywhere, but sacramentally, it's better to be in a church. But there's that one person that knows me better than I know myself, that loves me more than I love myself, and has no time for my BS, but tolerates it, because if I, and as the Psalms say, if you, O Lord, lay bare our guilt, who could endure it? So he just kind of goes, like the way that the rest of the people in the office tolerate Michael's weirdness. God tolerates my stupidity.
For God, reality is a cringe comedy.
Oh, yeah, it's well, on one level, the tragedy of the universe might one day be a comedy, right? But that's when St. Paul says, I believe that the sufferings of this present life are not worth being compared to the glory that is to be revealed in us. It's this, like, how could we possibly look at all the sufferings of our lives and then say God can make good on that? It's an audacious claim. And if it wasn't for the sufferings that Paul endured, we would think he was an idiot. And just in the same way, when God says to us, give me your sufferings, they're okay. I will make them a blessing for you. We could easily call BS on God, unless he became human and embraced them all. Right? Like, it's an essential component of our Christian life. And we spend most of our time trying to talk about, popes and cardinals and controversies in the Vatican. It's like, well, God became human, man. Let's talk about that. But anyway,
it's deep. I mean, the difficulty always with these eternal truths is in translation, right? It's sort of giving people a touchstone, because you say that and I immediately know what you're talking about, but not everyone knows, I think, what really that means, right? Like, again, like it's something that translates very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to translate into the modern world, I find.
It is, but it's obvious when you see it, right? Like, there's a distinct difference why Lord of the Rings can move the soul far more effectively than almost any other story, because it's in there, right? It's the same reason why when I listen to George MacDonald's fairy tales, I smile like an idiot, because he just there's a certain graciousness and a kindness you just can't fake, and there's so much fake out there, but people have this amazing ability to notice beauty and to notice authenticity, and even when a person is in rebellion against it and hates it out of resentment or anything like that, they still see it. So even if we can't replicate it, we can notice it, and that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I've learned more and more to lean on authenticity. That's the best way I can sort of translate my feelings into a secular context. And that is that, I think that you can always tell living religions from dead ones. Yes. And, I do think that the church has fallen on very difficult times, but its advantage is that the belief is sincere, and it's very hard to mistake somebody who's sincerely animated by belief compared to somebody who, by internet terms, is LARPing. And
yeah,
I think that the reason, Father, why people can't pray, I struggle with it. We're too cynical. We're too ironic. Ironic isn't an adjective. That's not. We're sort of crushed by our own sense of irony and by our own detachment. And so, the thing is that the temptation when you're praying is always to not absorb the words plainly, but to sort of reflect on how ridiculous it is that you're doing that.
Yes.
And
No, it's embedded. You have to see prayer as ridiculous. Like,
well,
that's why we
yeah,
dare
I
to
guess, I mean,
say our Father.
yeah, well, yeah, we have to sort of be at peace with being ridiculous too, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, like, I guess the thing that I kind of, I'm not saying I've cultivated this, but I get the sense that at least I'm getting a little bit better in this, is that it's sort of to not be so meta about these things, and to kind of
Yes.
like actually but just to sort of like, we're reading this thing like, we're reading the book of Samuel, from
Yeah.
um and the book of Samuel, it's a Old Testament book, and there's a lot of like, every time you read one of these Old Testament books, there's always, first of all, they're very violent, and the
Mm-hmm.
God, the God figure, the good God does not speak with the same kind of voice that modern Christianity familiarizes us. He's vengeful, and he's political,
Mm-hmm.
and strangely enough, that seems oddly fitting for the world we live in right now. I kind of want to get to know that God a lot more these days, um, and, you can sort of feel a thirst for God's justice that I would never have really felt was divine back in the day. But that's neither here nor there. The problem is, like, when you read these books, is they also have sort of like ridiculous passages. Like Samuel has this thing about golden hemorrhoids, and like it's like
Mm-hmm.
literally in there, like golden hemorrhoids. It's impossible to visualize. If you're a new atheist, you're already snickering about this stuff, right? Um, but like, I found that like this stuff matters less and less. The instinct of a formal Christian self would be like to apologize for that, to come up with an argument about why that's rational, uh,
Yeah.
and it's not to actually think about like this thing that's happening with this sort of
Yeah.
genocidal war between these two peoples in the ancient world, and to treat this as sort of like a strange detail, but sort of something like you would see on an alien planet. It's not something that you can really mock, because you don't have the context to mock it,
Yeah.
or the context to apologize for it. You just have to kind of let it wash over you in a very unironic way.
Well, one of the things about that Old Testament God and that merciful God of Jesus, they are the one and the same. And one of the best ways to see it is, if you know any amount of compassion for the downtrodden, right? I prayed about this a lot when I watched the Taken for the first time.
I haven't
And
seen
when
that
you
movie.
watch
That's the one with the one that everyone makes fun of with what's his face?
yeah, I will find you
Oh,
and I
find
will
you. Yeah,
kill
that's
you.
the one. Yeah.
Yeah, so you watched Liam Neeson as a
I know
dad
the
in a lot
names.
of choppy action scenes, killing a bunch of sex traffickers, right?
Yeah.
And I defy to find any man or woman that doesn't cheer when he kills those people,
Yeah.
right? Like, let's just be brutally honest here. It's a delightful feeling to watch sex traffickers get what's coming to them, and
Mhm.
that is built entirely on the premise of the love of the vulnerable.
Yeah.
Then the question is, though, is that you go into a reductio ad absurdum. When does it stop? Right? Because
Yeah. Well,
the divine justice is coming for everything and everyone. But then when you try to apply that logically, and then you say, well, I want God to bring justice on the earth, and then the next question is, what makes you think you're going to survive? What makes you
but
think that it's going
that's
to
the
be?
thing, right? Like, I think it's almost that is, there's this sort of weird desire where it's just like, okay, if justice is done, maybe that's sort of secondary. I mean, one of the things, like this whole desire for just punishment,
Yeah.
part of it's compassion for the downtrodden. Part of it's also just that what you're sort of seeing destroyed is in itself disgusting, even if the person themselves is the image of God. They're
Yes.
involved in an act that is so, that's almost an act of desecration of the image of God, and
Yes.
there needs to be some kind of violent rectification of that. And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a better way, or there's a more saintly way to deal with it. But I guess obviously King David
Well, it
didn't do
depends on the
that,
man's state of
right?
life.
But yeah, I
No,
mean,
but
so
well, so I'm a priest. I'm a
yeah,
priest. right? You're a dad, right?
Sure.
So your job in defending your children and those under your care is different than what mine would be. So this is where the differences in people's roles and vocations actually does come into play. But and you're right to point out that one of the sins that's in sin itself is the marring of the divine image even on the sinner, right? Like that person could have been a saint, that person could have blessed the world with their life and with their example, and instead he decided to live as a sex trafficker. And then he could say, well, I didn't have a choice. It's like, yeah, whatever. But so you see, like, there's that issue there. But then if you want to roll it all the way back, I think that part of the Christian mystery is God saying to us, I'm going to take responsibility for all of this. When God bears the cross, when God enters our humanity and makes it his own, he, in a weird way, is acknowledging his part in creating a world where we cannot even begin to understand the commandments that he is giving us to live, and also their consequences. That there has to, like, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about St. Paul, there has to be some kind of way in which God can rectify all of this. And it seems to me that the only way it's possible is that God actually enters the world, becomes human, and then embraces everything that is about the consequences of his choice to create us in creation. And then saying, and I'm going to wear all of those wounds until the end of time and beyond. Like, and I don't see a divine justice without that anymore. And I don't think that the Christian churches, Catholic and all the other denominations, will be able to face this modern world unless we acknowledge that there's a lot of suffering out there that people can't quantify. Mental illness,
Oh my good Lord, mental illness is
the
very
list just
real.
goes on and on. I'm just going through like this Rolodex of my experiences.
Our psychologically, our generation is just destroyed. I can't. We haven't even begun to take stock of it. It's really scary.
No. It is. It's absolutely terrifying, and I'm watching it tear families apart. And one of the most terrifying things about it is that weird line that mental illness runs between moral and psychological, because they're not the same thing, right? So if a person has mental distress, then and sometimes even physical, then the question is did I do something to deserve this? And then when somebody says no, you didn't do, they don't believe you. So how do we face that? And I this is another one of those scenarios where I say I have no bloody clue. Like, there's a buzzword that's coming out of the Holy Father and a lot of bishops these days called accompaniment, but I can't find a better word. Like, accompaniment sounds to me like I have no idea what, but here I am. Like, it's just showing up because there's no cognitive answer for such an abyss of misunderstanding. And, like, in a sense, that was kind of like the whole point of the, today you'll be with me in paradise. It's like, it's a gutsy thing to say. But he said it, and he meant it.
That's what they say. Who said this? It said, "Never despair, for one of the thieves on the cross was saved, but never rest on your laurels, because one of the thieves on the cross was lost," or something like that. I can't exactly remember the quote, but that there was some famous Catholic author who said that. One, I guess, it's about the hour mark, so we were going to take super chats, but just so we can kind of curve
I'd be happy to take super chats if you want to.
Well, I think I disabled super chats, but just questions from the chat.
Sure, whatever. I don't know. This streamer world, I don't get.
I guess the perspective I've been thinking about recently is, what hope do you see for the generation that's coming directly after ours? We're in our 30s. The people coming after us in their 20s, they never knew a pre-social media world. And pretty soon, a generation will come that never knew a world before this whole COVID stuff. And, I guess I obviously don't want you to predict the future, but what do you see as sort of the path towards some kind of hope for them not making the same mistakes that our generation did?
Well, again, one of the things that made me want to become Catholic was when I was studying European history. It always felt as if Chesterton described it as the 5 deaths of the faith. There was always these times when the world just seemed to be going absolutely bonkers and that there was absolutely no hope. And then all of a sudden, a people or a person, usually groups of people, but then historically we kind of homogenize it into one person. But one person or a community of people, they just decide to make a choice, and they decide to actually just live the faith. But here's the thing: I can't predict that. That's volitional, and that's grace, right? So that's God calling someone, and that's that person actually responding. God calls everybody in some way or form, proper to their nature and how he made them. But it's so many variables, it's impossible to predict. I can say that it would have to do with holiness, but with no plan. Francis, Cluny, Benedict, John Henry Newman, a lot of these great turning point figures in world and church history, they didn't have a plan. They just tried to live their vocation, live holiness in their time. And then when they lived it, this is the important part. What they tried to build, they had taken from them. So Benedict wanted to just live a life of holiness in a small community, and then he wound up becoming the founder of Western monasticism. Francis just wanted to give up his family's title and his money and just live as a beggar, and he had this whole army of people follow him. John Henry Newman just wanted to return England to apostolicity and Catholicity of faith, and his life just got completely turned upside down. So I can only say there's going to be 2 things. One, God will not abandon us, because he hasn't and never will. He promised he'd be with us until the end of the age. 1. And 2, it's not until we're able to cry, my God, why have you forsaken me, that the path will become clear.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. I think this is, I said this is in a different context, but I said this. Everyone who's sort of on the anti-progressive side of things, they want to come up with all of these tricks and these rhetorical devices to sort of trick people back to truth. And that never works, because you can only do that from a position of power, and power has been completely corrupted. So the only solution seems to be kind of just sort of let go and let just sort of everything kind of fall to the ground with sort of a plainness of truth. Just be like, okay, so this is it, right? This is just how it is, like this. And I don't try to actually, in some ways, trying to spin things is hurting the process.
Yes.
Of just kind of sincerely just experiencing the ridiculousness of the moment we are, and not really trying to move it, but just sort of letting things fall to the ground of truth. And I think that that's what sort of what you're saying is not just simply in sort of a rhetorical or dialectic capacity, in the same sense that we sort of have to dialectically not play tricks, but just be, boom, that's how it is. In order sort of to politically live in this world, or just live, we just have to figure out what are our most fundamental values, and then just sort of, just discard everything else and let everything else slide, and just go for the things that we consider fundamentally the most valuable. And
I think that
all these other plans just need to kind of wash away as in the chaos of their own creation.
I will give another mythic description, maybe of what I kind of mean to say too, is Aragorn won because while he didn't know where Frodo was, he fought a pointless battle to give Frodo his chance.
Mm-hmm.
That I see is the point of the political, to distract the gaze of the power mongers just long enough for the real thing, the real victory to be accomplished. But the real victory was even more painful. Frodo had to carry the ring, but he needed to have the humility enough to let Sam help him. And he also needed the humility to forgive Gollum every step of the way.
Mm-hmm.
All four were necessary, right? So you needed Aragorn to do his thing, and you needed Frodo, Sam, and Gollum to do their thing. So I think that sometimes people also fall into despair when they think that, unless they can see the recapitulation of all things in their narrative, then they give up. It's like, no, just do your part in the story. Because I'm pretty sure that after I'm dead, there's going to be a whole bunch of mistakes and screw ups that I've made that some other priest in the future is going to have to fix, just as I'm fixing some of the screw ups that some of my predecessors have made. But that God will be the one that restores all things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good stopping point to kind of go for questions. If people want to reply me in the chat, or I say super chat, but really the thing I'm receiving is entropy. I'll put the entropy thing in the description again in case you're interested. I see my friend the Franklin, who I mentioned this stream, trolling me, asking me when I'm going to release my video, my stream on Shrek distributism. This is something, Father, I know you're not a YouTuber, but for those of you out there who are doing YouTube, never, ever, ever promise a video. Ever. Never do that. I promised one video when I kind of went on hiatus as my family started, basically. And I'm like, okay, when I come back, I'm going to do this video on distributism because that's the name of my channel. I've never done it. And then another video, I recorded half of it and I stopped because I got really busy at work. And then the notes of that video became like this novel. And it's just sitting on my deck, this stack of paper. I'm like, how am I going to turn this into a video? Like, it's been years since I wrote this. This is a thing on YouTube, is to be a successful YouTuber, you just want to make your essays, you just want to get it out as fast as possible. And so these videos are just hanging over my head like the sort of Damocles at the stage. But
Yep.
so it's just why the Franklin's trolling me.
It's good to have friends that piss you off.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the YouTube people love trolling each other. Although we should really stop saying YouTube, because as everyone knows, our time on this platform is incredibly limited, right? Oh, and of course, no one watches anywhere else other than YouTube. Everyone watch me on Odyssey. Don't give. Well, you literally don't have the option to give Google your money. You can only give Entropy your money. So in the event that one person, so my wife brought me a piece of paper with a question on it, which I'll just read you the question, but you're not going to answer it, and I'm not going to answer it, but it is a good question. Someone asks, or Iron Duke asks, what your opinion about the Vatican's movement against the Latin Mass celebrants is. So I have a policy on the stream to not sort of air interchurch politics, or to at least minimize it. And I certainly think it's probably inappropriate for us to vote to voice political opinions about church politics in this stream. So, but I just wanted to acknowledge that I received the message, right? I kind of find my personal opinion is that the Latin Mass is beautiful and people should celebrate it. But I'm not going to comment on decisions made by or statements made by the Pope or the Holy See in this stream. So I just wanted to get that out there.
Duly noted.
Yeah. The people always want you to do this. This is something people always want drama. I try to minimize interdenominational Christian infighting, and I certainly don't want to. There was this thing in 2018. There was all these scandals, and they got me really angry. But the problem is that there's nothing we can do about it. And airing the grievances actually makes the problem worse in a lot of ways, at least in the internet. I'm not saying that
Well,
you can't
I'll say
organize
this
to
the church
address some of
too.
these corruptions personally, but like I can't creating a message that just that it is there's no good end that comes from that, in my opinion.
So I will answer the question indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been in my formation, I would have to sit through liturgies that I consider to be abominable.
Yeah.
And I was asked to do things and sometimes told to do things that made my skin crawl. Not immoral things, but it was verging on, do you even understand the liturgy at all? And yet, the fun part is that it kind of taught me a little courtesy, because when I realized how little people understood, and where sin really revolves is what you know. So if you know something is immoral and act upon it, or when you don't know and you act upon it, they're completely different categories. And so I had to hold myself to a certain standard, and then also do as much as I could to hold somebody else to a completely different standard. And then after I've been ordained a few years, I get it. The people that undermine a goal in the church are the ones that push it so much without realizing all the other pieces that have to be moved to get to a point. So, like, say a person wants to talk about social justice in their parish, it's like, okay. And then they don't let up. They're just constantly talking about it. And until, for instance, that person gets that the church is not to be a temple of politics, is what we were talking about at the beginning, I won't let them do anything. Right? Like, until you get that the church is not a place for you to launch your hobby horse, but it's where
These people, they want to talk about social justice. So I feel that's very rarely the case. They want to posture. That
well, everyone wants to posture.
Yeah.
Like most people, when they come up to the priest and then they say, you should do this. Like, just like, oh yeah, here comes a posturing moment, and you smile and you go, yeah. I've gotten all those, like, Father, you really, we should be doing this, or blah, blah, blah. And my favorite is when the Pope says, I'm like, uh-huh. It's like, you remember when Benedict was Pope?
Yeah.
Did you jump to action when he said something, or when Benedict was Pope, and then you said the Pope says, but now that Francis is Pope, are you jumping to action now? Right? So the whole practice is to earn people's trust by willing to immolate yourself, because there's no greater spiritual danger than spiritual pride. And
Yeah.
the danger of spiritual pride is that Satan thinks he's fighting a holy war. And one of my jobs as a priest is to unite the social justice person, the trad person, the person that just wants a place to raise their kids, the person that wants a community because they're lonely and old, and yet somehow guide all of them to Jesus. And if somebody wants to use my parish, for instance, as a launching board for their pet project, oh, I'm sorry, it's over.
Yes, and I should, and I think these questions will be answered not by how they're argued, but just by the people who show up ultimately.
Yep. Oh yeah, big deal.
So, if you feel that the church should be doing something, just don't abandon the church, and eventually you'll be vindicated, because eventually the church is going to fall on very hard times shortly.
Oh yeah.
And harder than it has right now. And the people who stand by her are the people who are going to ultimately prevail, not because they argue their case in some kind of court of a public opinion, but because they're loyal to the monarch when the monarch is at their lowest point.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, for instance, for me, one of the joys of being a priest now is I didn't become a priest when the pay was good and everybody bowed and scraped at my feet and said, "Oh, Father, blah, 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 blah." Like, I became a priest. I first thought about the priesthood during the Boston sex abuse scandal. I was mocked by my professors and classmates when I was in university. And then I got the backlash from so-called anti-clericalist Catholics when I was in the seminary. And then I had to deal with the other side of it too. So now when somebody wants to say to me, it's like, oh, well, you're just here for a faction. I'm like, really? Really? Sure? Okay. It's like, if you show up and you do your job and you do it for the love of God, it becomes abundantly clear pretty fast.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And this is, okay. Well, where was I? Yeah, I think it's good to go on to the, so this is a question from last time. Barry White. Hey Dave, sorry I missed your stream. I think this is literally the stream I did when I was in your neck of the woods, so to speak. Do you have any book or video suggestions for me to learn about critical theory? Many of my friends have bought into the CRT agenda. I don't know how to talk to them. Well, okay, Ben White, this is definitely not so much what we're talking about today, but I'll answer this question. Maybe you probably have some opinions. I mean, you can read about, first of all, critical theory and critical race theory aren't really the same thing. Critical theory comes from the Frankfurt School, and its heyday was in the 60s, the early 60s. And a lot of the people, they were like ex-Trotskyists or from like Central Europe, and they were they're actually very socially conservative. They hated jazz and thought it was decadent. And their main criticism was that like cultural capitalism is causing our culture to lose sight of high art and stuff like that. And the only way to save these higher things is to basically abandon the mores of modern American society. And this is sort of taken and turned into critical race theory. Like it was kind of extended in this weird direction. None of these authors, I find the critical theorists, and I have read barely any of them. I've read a little bit of Adorno, but I know the gist of them. I find them much more interesting than the people like Kimberly Crenshaw and whatever. Derek Bell, I think, is the other one from the 80s. The race guys, Noel Ignatieff. I find the sort of race guys totally totally insufferable. But here's the thing, though. When your friends are becoming involved in this sort of fanaticism over this race stuff in the modern, they're not reading like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, and they're certainly not reading Adorno and like Marcuse and stuff like that. They're just reacting to social media posts. These texts are going to give you absolutely no understanding of their motivations. They didn't read them. I guess it's sort of interesting historically to understand how these ideas evolved. But it's sort of strange because the older ideas have no resemblance to the newer ones. They've been transmogrified. Can anyone imagine someone like Adorno looking at modern woke capital and going like, yeah, that's awesome? Like absolutely not, right? And we were talking about this a little bit. Like these religions, they're so chaotic that they go from being totally materialism to sort of rederiving Gnosticism in the space of 60 years. Like material. We're all just bodies. And then 10 years later, it's like, well, I'm really like this other gender or this other person based on some ineffable essence that's derived completely from my preference. It has nothing to do with my body. So I don't know. I mean, the problem is you can just tie yourselves in knots trying to understand these incoherent ideas. But I'm rambling, but I'll give you a chance to have any takes on CRT or critical theory or the likes. Or
I would skip CRT and CT entirely. Listen, the person. If CRT and CT are basically pseudo religions, which they kind of are. If you're trying to get somebody out of a cult or a dangerous religion, you don't antagonize them. The important thing is to listen to what drew them or attracted them to it, and then almost help them along their journey. Because if a person, for instance, goes into CRT, for instance, using it as an example, because it's not the one you asked, just to kind of make a point. If somebody goes into CRT thinking that it's actually going to end racism, it doesn't take a lot of steps to disavow them of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like here's a simple one. If you define people as BIPOC or persons of color, what you've done is you've made persons of color or BIPOC derivative of the natural, which is white people, right? Mm-hmm. you've had white people as the norm, and then everyone else, and that's what the whole BIPOC thing is. It's basically just a reversed kind of, I don't want to say it's reverse racism, but it basically just looks at it from the other side of the coin. So
well,
if
it's
you
politicization, right? Because
yeah.
Politics has to be binary, so you have to sort of divide it. Politics by its nature is binary.
Yeah, but if you just say to them, hey, there's a better method of getting what you want, you don't need to antagonize them, which is when if you tell somebody they're in a cult that they're in a cult, what's the first thing that they're going to do? They're going to double down.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of a paradoxical thing, right? Whereas oftentimes the people who you most want to argue with are sort of the people who would benefit the least from an argument.
Yes, absolutely.
But and politics obviously complicates this.
Yeah, like I hear people, for instance, claiming that the Christians saying absolute garbage, and I don't tell them that what they think is garbage, because they're oftentimes just trying to sort out the traumas and the difficulties of their life. And so in their kind of unconscious mind, when I tell them that their thought process is, let's just say, less than developed, then they take it really personal, and then without realizing it, think that I'm insulting their dead grandmother, which makes no sense, but that's how they feel. So if you tell them that CRT is stupid, and you see this on the news, right? If you tell them CRT is stupid, then they'll think, oh, you're racist then. Mm-hmm. Ugh. Anyway, that's my thought. That's my thought on that.
Yeah, it's a very large topic. I mean, this is the problem is, what we're dealing with in politics is sort of power addiction, right? And it's not a very it's not ending well for our society. The same person asks, furthermore, as Ben White says, furthermore, I have quite a few Catholic friends who have embraced the woke ideology to varying degrees. It feels like I can't even speak freely in my church community anymore. What can I do? Well, that's interesting. Maybe I could open this up to you, Father. Maybe you could broaden it to just be the politicization of the church community in the 21st century.
Street cred is really important. So you don't need to engage in their talking points. First, you can go to church and not be a jerk. That's really important. The number one reason why a lot of people on the so-called political right are not liked by the people on the left is that because they're just disagreeable individuals in their experience. Mm-hmm. So they judge everything by being nice and kind. And so if you're not nice and kind, you're immediately anathema to how they think. So work really hard at appreciating their virtues and learning how to speak, in a sense, their language without losing your conscience. Then learn how to frame your ideas in their language. So for instance, when I'm trying to explain extremely traditionalistic ideas, I often explain it to my parishioners by saying, the teaching of Vatican II, blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. So I'll cite Sacrosanctum Concilium or something, or Lumen Gentium, or all these church documents that came out of Vatican II. So then the pro-Vatican II crew thinks, oh, well, obviously this is important teaching, but I'm actually giving them something really traditional. Or if I'm trying to make a point to more traditionally minded things, I'll cite a church father, or maybe I'll cite Thomas Aquinas, because you want to cite people or ideas or movements that they already trust, and then build on that, and then also learn when to pick your battles and when not to fight.
What also seems what you're really trying to do, though, Father, is something that we talk a lot about, is what you're trying to do is people have sort of comfortable narrative grooves that they just kind of move along. And so what you want to do is you want to kind of break people out of these narrative grooves so that they're interacting with these concepts at a very primal and frenetic level. And
So
that
what
sometimes
happens in
works.
life of the church is that it constantly puts you in danger of the other side. So if you're a leftist and you're going to church, you're going to be you're going to be living in a patriarchal institution that believes in tradition and believes in revelation, right? And then if you're a conservative minded person, you're going to have to believe that you're going to have to accept the fact that God is always going to reveal himself in counterintuitive ways and break out of older systems. And at any moment, at any Sunday, at any given moment, you have to be prepared for God to completely destroy the system, either system. And so what that means is then for the person who's sick and tired of the social justice nonsense that can happen inside a parish, what they can do is then they can approach the social justice thing, say, for instance, through a liturgical lens. And it is like oftentimes progressive types, they'll always cite the prophet Amos or Hosea or something like that, right? But Hosea's whole premise is, well, Israel is an adulterous woman. It's like, well, now we're talking about a disregard for the poor as adultery. It's like, ha, ha, ha. You can always troll the system using revelation.
Yeah, I can see that. It's a strange question about how to deal with this exactly. And I don't know. I think people are just kind of, I mean, in the same way that we have, people treating politics like religion, we also have people treating religion like politics, and that's sort of a struggle of our age. I'm going to go on to the next question because I think we've answered this question sufficiently. So TN 1000 says, have you ever seen Megamind, Dave? It's like Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, but where the villain gets the girl by becoming a good person. I had my dad listen to your review of Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog on a long drive, and he brought it up. Well, I mean, I never seen Megamind, but Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog and Megamind. I've seen the previews for Megamind. And this is sort of like, they're very much a function of sort of the late 2000 new atheism scene, where they're like about smart guys. That's what, like, science guys that like want to save the world. And Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog is obviously supposed to be a tragedy. And I guess Megamind's supposed to be, where it works out great. But it's sort of the same idea where it's like, how does a guy in the 2000s get credibility? Well, he's really smart and he's not an asshole. And like, that's the only two things required. And what's so funny is that we all can't really be smart. I have a lot of intellectual limitations myself, as you might understand by the fact that I always flub words, and I have a real problem with details and a lot of other things. I couldn't get through higher math in college in a lot of dimensions. Real analysis was not my friend. But we all have limitations, and then they're not moral. And what turned out for the millennials is that they weren't as smart as they thought they were, and it turned out that not being an asshole was a lot harder than we thought it was, because we're all collectively failing at that in our 30s. Pardon me, but I don't know if you have any opinions about the movies Megamind or Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog.
No, I haven't seen that. I laughed when you talked about millennials not being as they thought they were. But one of the things that I found about intellect is that sometimes the best thing that an intellect can do is hide itself as well. It's a tremendous skill to be a guy like G.K. Chesterton to have discussions with. Oh no, better is he Thomas Aquinas. But Chesterton describes the story of Aquinas getting a letter from a person, and just that's really simple, and he just kind of casually and courteously replies to it. I think that that's where a lot of people fail, is their their appreciation of self is so attached to their talents and their gifts that they can't realize that there's something more that they can just, so that they can let go of that and not have those talents and gifts be acknowledged. And I think that's the issue. Not so much that people are not smart enough, is that they can't not be smart.
Mm-hmm. Sort of the cult of the mind, so to speak.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also like we haven't. There's this sort of thing where like millennials haven't figured out. Like our society tells us that it's not about aging gracefully; it's just about never aging, like always being a child. And in the same way, people, it's about being smart. But what people really should focus on is they should focus on where they can't be smart, be simple, like
And
be.
wise.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a certain amount of wisdom to simplicity. And I know simple is it is sort of a synonym for being dull, but it also sort of indicates sort of a genius in simplicity,
Yeah.
and that's the thing that I think that our culture has lost, intentionally. So it hasn't like, oh wow, do we get even more super chats? Okay, hold on, let me see
Take your
where are
time,
we?
man.
Yeah, okay, well
I'm hungry.
we got a lot of them. I've been dilly dallying. Okay, so someone's asking me. Nicholas Dollinger says, "Did you catch Curtis Yarvin's appearance on the Beautiful Toilet podcast? A 3-hour discussion about poetry and the current literary scene. You might find it interesting." I have not caught that podcast. I don't think, unless that's the one he did with that whole New York. There's this alternative New York film, like sort of post-left film scene that he went on these really young people who are kind of doing this whole post-leftist thing, which I find incredibly refreshing. And he went on a podcast, and it was very interesting talking about it. I would love to hear that, because people are really sort of bending their attention in a much more aesthetic direction, and I think that's the right move. I mean, I know I don't disparage anyone for doing politics to the extent that you can do genuine good, but I'm just saying it really does have a corrupting influence. So Nicholas Dollinger, you asked this question twice. So and I don't really have any I don't have two answers to the same question. So thank you very much for the donation. Marcus Aurelius for $5. I'm a 17-year-old high school student, and most people do not strive for a higher connection to God. Do you think that the latter generation will have a rekindled search for the teachings of the Bible and God? Father, do you want to take this one?
I think that in this regard, every generation is very similar to every other generation. I find that people's rejection of God is often an echo of a search for God at the same time. So even when it looks like one generation is trying to abandon God, interpreted generously, it could be their way of saying what we were taught to be God is not quite God enough. And then there's the generations that seem to have a tremendous amount of religious fervor, but behind them might also be a latent need for reform or purification. So this present generation, just as my generation, they're always going to be faced with a choice, and that choice is between them and God, and as individuals and as a community. So it's I'm reluctant to say anything different about these ones. I just think that the character of it will be completely different. I think that the basis of it will have to start from alienation first. Like, we will have to take the complete gong show that the last 2 decades have been, and the despair and hopelessness that they engendered because of all the false promises. We're going to have to take that as a datum. Whereas the early 20th century, early 1900s, the stupid optimism also needed to be contradicted. So, on one level, it's more hopeful to me now because we can start grasping at a new kind of hope, a deeper hope, rather than having to build in like okay, things are good now, guys, but remember. So, yeah, I'll leave that alone.
Yeah, I to connect this with the previous chat that was given to me twice that I couldn't answer. I guess he's saying that the podcast I was thinking of was the one he was talking about. There's one common connection between this question and the last one, and that is on that podcast in question. You're listening to a lot of these people in their young 20s, and this is admittedly not a representative sample, but these people are people who are kind of coming to a certain amount of self-awareness about where social media has left us, and they're not liking it, and they have what comes out and what's really refreshing is this deep yearning for something that's deeper and more meaningful and impactful. And I think that's going to be the challenge of. I think people don't really have a good word for it. That desire for something that's deeper and more meaningful, and this is sort of always implicitly behind the scenes, more meaningful and deep and meaningful in an ultimate sense. This is obviously a desire for what we would call God. It's just whether we can come up with a collective language to express this. That really is the I mean, whether we can admit that that's what we want, and then after we admit that this is what we want, we have to come up with a collective language to express this, and then the political will to pursue it. Right? And I think that's the challenge for the next generation, and for those good faith millennials among us to facilitate that. I highly suspect that millennials' true heroism will come in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it will be largely undoing what they did in their 20s. We'll have to be the boomers we always wanted the boomers to be, is the formulation I'm coming to currently.
I would
Everything you want the boomers to do now, remember, you're going to have to do that when you're their age. You're going to have to be the based boomers when you're actually 50 or 60.
One of the things that I've noticed is that when millennials or Zoomers are at their worst is when they blame boomers for everything, not realizing that they're perpetuating it. Right?
I've been somewhat guilty of that.
So I noticed this in church life, for instance. So I would listen to old clerics and old church people say to me, it's like, oh, well, we stood up against our parents and we reformed the church and changed the church for a new age. This is the 60s, through on, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But then a few years later, when I was in the seminary under Benedict, I would hear those same people, and they would range from bishops and nuns and priests and lay people. Then they would say to me, it's like, I don't understand this new generation. It's like they're trying to go back into tradition. Why don't they, acknowledge the good things that we tried to do for them? And I just kind of looked at them in a kind of stupefied disbelief. It was like, you do realize they're enacting your rebellion. Like, there's a deep sickness in our culture in that it's one generation against the other. No. Sins of the fathers go at least 3 generations. This is Exodus, right? So sins of the fathers goes down 3 generations. So what our great-grandparents did, we're still doing. But if we choose to do the right thing and we choose to honor the Lord our God, then it goes down for hundreds of generations. So, yeah. Yeah, watch out who you criticize, because you'll be them.
Well, I mean, yes, we have to be aware of that. I'm gonna leave it at that, I think, and I'm going to go on to the next super chat. I think it's entropy donation. I should say that super chat. Salad fork for Canadian $5. I recently became interested in religion and Catholicism in particular, but I just can't bring myself to respect the institution of the church, because it appears to commonly put temporal matters ahead of spiritual ones. How do you square this circle? That's a tough question. I wish I could ask for specifics on this matter, other than just plain pure corruption. I suspect he might be thinking about uh, some aesthetic and political decisions made by the most recent pontificate, but we probably should steer clear around that particular issue. Do you have any thoughts on this, Father?
Kind of. I found that this is when I was becoming Catholic, right? So the thing that actually made me the most excited to be Catholic was not the purity of the present witness. It was the fact that the church still exists at all. So I became Catholic in the middle of the John Paul II, the end of the John Paul II pontificate, just when we started to get completely hammered by the sex abuse crises and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then hearing about how all that stuff kind of went down. And then I was taking some classes in university on medieval history, and I was looking at all the scandals of the medieval church, and I was strangely enough, I was attracted by it, not by the possibility of doing evil myself, but one of those things that evil does is that if a house is divided against itself, it cannot stand. Like, it's always the vices of a nation that destroy it, and not just the vices of a nation, but even more painfully, the virtues it can't transcend. So sometimes a person, for instance, will have a virtue, but because they won't let it go, that virtue becomes corrupt. So it's like a righteous person that becomes a sanctimonious righteous person. It's a person who's pure that winds up hating the body. The list goes on and on and on and on. So at a certain point, to be able to say, there's a good that I would love to see, but maybe I'm not going to be able to see it. And yet, what have happened to people that have lived this very same thing? So the disciples themselves had the example of Jesus, who was on one level every one of their hopes and dreams. Then he's crucified and everything falls apart, and then engage the cycle, right? So even in the first century, the church was on the brink of collapse immediately after the death of the first apostles, the Nero persecution, and then for some strange reason, the ship came back up again. Or you can have the total collapse of the church in terms of credibility after the Constantinian peace, and the church is able to be public. And so then, because the church is able to be public, then all those people that cowered because they were too afraid to become Christian in the time of persecution now join it during peacetime, revealing that it's actually even more difficult in that time. So what I'm trying to get at is to find those things about the church or a Christian life that you dislike and actually hold on to them with gratitude. Because they're the thing that's going to prevent you from just naively joining a cult. The question is God here? Did Jesus Christ do this? That's the question. We don't need somebody joining a church because they like it or it's their preference, because that's not what discipleship is. Discipleship is, I have no idea what the hell is going on, but I trust him. And by that I mean Jesus. I'm not talking about me or any other dude.
And I will add here more briefly and more directly, the church's grace only applies to spiritual matters, not to its political stances. I mean, this is very famous, is that Dante, the Florentinian poet. I read like the Inferno 3 or 4 times at this stage. Not the Inferno, the comedy. Plebeian mistake. And don't only read the Inferno. The best part actually is Purgatory, and then some chapters of Paradiso. But obviously Dante's big gripe that you see very prominently in Inferno is the displacement of, I believe it was the White Guelphs. They're basically Ghibellines. The Ghibellines, which were sort of the supporters of the Holy Roman Empire, had been displaced by the Guelphs, which were supporters of sort of the Pope through France. And this was accomplished by one Pope in particular, Boniface. And Dante is furious about this political move by the church. And I have no doubt that this was a corrupt move. That the Ghibelline cause was just, and actually, I kind of do believe the Ghibelline cause was just. I would have supported that if I lived in that age myself, but that's neither here nor there. That's not really the church's. That corruption is not really what we should think about when we approach the church as the steward of Christ. And although politics is always louder, I think that's a mistake in how we approach our religion. We can't base our religious views on politics, even though that's what the world asks us to do.
Well, this goes back to the thing that I was saying at the end of the original discussion, is that Aragorn is a distraction for Frodo, right? Politics is a distraction for what the faith is. But if you take the Catholic Church seriously, and if the historical revelation happened the way that God intended, that means that the pattern of the church is actually to be a persecuted minority in a pagan world, right? Like that's so. It's not like the beginning of Islam when it starts, when the first Ummah is created, when they're actually able to create an Islamic state. No, the beginning of Christianity is an underground persecuted community.
Christianity begins with the priesthood, not the kinghood. Yeah. And these are separate things. And I think this is such a large topic. People are very much waiting for a Constantine or an Aragorn or a. They're waiting for a Clovis at this stage. Which is, not much to wait for, but maybe preferable to chaos. Certainly, anything's preferable to chaos.
Yeah, well,
I think that's what people are obviously asking for. They're, pardon me.
Anyone who's struggling with religious conviction might not like a Clovis settling the matter for them.
Well, that guy ruled by the axe, right? But yeah. This is one of those whole, discussing the Merovingians probably is outside of the scope of this particular question. What we're going on here, we need to get into these chats. Question for Father David. I graduated from uni last spring. I moved back to my hometown for work, and I lost most of my college. But most of my high school friends have left, and my college friends are slowly slipping away from me because of the distance. How do I make friends after college? That is a very difficult thing, by the way. Also, could Father suggest some good spiritual readings? I really struggle with praying consistently and viewing impure materials. That's an excellent question.
Yeah, remarkable. Spiritual reading often depends on your baseline. Always start with the scriptures. And then when somebody comes to me for the first time and is not really practicing or anything, I usually suggest the Gospel of Mark. And then the next thing I usually do is set them on the path of the early church fathers. So these are the apostolic age, first 2 centuries of the church. Because then what you see, and then just to follow chronologically, but some people don't like doing that, or that's just not necessarily their bag. But Saint Irenaeus, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, those are always great guys to read. I have a certain preference personally for whether or not he's Catholic. I love C.S. Lewis. I love George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton. And this is the important part. Don't try to understand everything. Oftentimes people have this idea that they're supposed to read the Bible and it's all supposed to make sense. Sometimes just learning how to almost just dive in and just swim and not have this feeling that you need to be able to, hold the pool, but be in the pool is much better. And then you'll find that that skill of letting go is also one of the better skills in terms of making new friends, because what will happen regardless of where you go, I like it either in a church or in a workplace or in some kind of hobby that you happen to build up. You need hobbies. um, People gravitate towards a person. Well, what would, Dave and I were just saying, as an authentic person that will listen to them. So to start, so when you read the scriptures, when you pray, interact with God as if He's actually listening to you, because He is. Haha. And then extend that courtesy to other people slowly, and acknowledge your limits, boundaries. Say, I don't know if I can handle that, or that just seems to be too much. And when you do that, don't blame other people for that. Like, don't say, oh, I don't hang out with those people because they're stupid. Just say, you know what? I'm not going to go to that because, you know, um, whatever reason. But try to avoid personalizing things either for yourself or with other people, so that when you read something, you don't take it personally. When you interact with somebody, you don't take it personally. You can live a kind of lighthearted life. And then you can kind of realize that, well, God does that with us every day. Like, God loves you desperately in the sense that He thirsts for you, and yet He does you the courtesy of not overwhelming you. That helped me a lot. God could come down for the sky, settle all questions, hitch slap Hitchens, and settle all doubt. But that's not the point. The point is to be someone with someone. There, that's my answer.
Yeah, I would add to that, for reading the Bible. I never know to recommend people in terms of spiritual reading. It's impossible to know it without knowing the person. Some people need to read orthodoxy. Some people can take on, like, Saint Augustine. But there's a whole cottage industry of really kind of ruining people to St. Augustine by forcing them to read it before they even understand the issues in play. And they have, like, first year atheist college students reading Augustine, and atheist professors teaching it. It's just a horrible experience. In order to read scripture well, I think you need to be able to understand. We lost the ability to read scripture when we lost the ability to read poetry, because so much of the scripture itself is poetry, or said in a poetical way. And you can't read poetry unless you have a certain amount of ability to be, because poetry is kind of silly, right? So you have to have sort of an unironic nature to you to be able to do that. And that's the same way you need to approach these old texts, or certainly things like, uh, a lot of the books in the Bible. While I'm making friends, I would add, routine is your friend. Uh,
Yeah,
Obviously, this is
yeah,
all based on a pre-COVID world, so like, I don't know, but you want to do something. I don't even know how. The problem is that routines are hard to establish when people are locking things down constantly. But you need to turn your hobbies into good habits. Like, if you like a sport, or if you like a even some nerdy hobby, just do it socially, like every X night, right? And then you'll meet people that way. And I think that's the best thing you can do. The COVID really makes this hard to answer, because COVID started just when I became a parent. So my social life already was nuked by the time that happened. So I don't really have a good frame of reference to answer this question. Uh, so anyway, I'll keep on going because I spent a long time on that question. Here's a good question. For Spiffis for $5. Aren't politics and religion inherently intertwined? Politics is the tension in human power relations and religion's attempt to set the standard of how humans should cooperate and interact. Yeah, I agree that uh, all religion is political. There's no way to make it not political. Um, but religion is something that everyone should do and has to do in order to be an authentic human. And politics is something that's very dangerous to deal with. It is incredibly corrosive, and because it involves power, and people get addicted to that. And it involves in democratic politics, worse than that, involves clout. So, it's like saying, I don't know. I mean, it's like saying it's like the difference between a nutritious meal and like a meal which is going to have some amount of sugar and salt, and then like these fast food meals that are just all sugar and salt. And that's what modern politics is. Modern politics is the religion of it's basically putting politics, which is about managing power, into the guise of a religion, so people can religiously partake in pornographic experiences of power. And that's the issue we're dealing with right now. There's no way that an honest church, in my opinion, can be apolitical. But that being said, like, you come into the church looking for the church to repeat your political views back to yourself. You're basically trying to poison the church's mission.
Yeah.
And that's a huge problem.
The invention of the secular was one of the great inventions of Christendom, which is that it's a realm of human power that God says, you figure it out, because it's ultimately inconsequential. This is a uniquely Christian thing, to that you have an eternal God who actually cares about your well-being, but also creates a realm of freedom where it is not of divine origin. That's why the Christian creed has no political structure attached to it, and it never can. That even if Christ is king, he still wants the acclamation of the people, right? Like, that's still his desire. He doesn't just want to reign as a king. So you can't have a political system on earth claiming that they have somehow found the summum bonum of all Christian life, which is bunk, right? So when Christendom was a thing, it was several different kingdoms, duchies, empires, all kind of living their own unique cultural, religious, and social identities in a local way. This is the miracle of medieval Europe, that all the different elector princes, all of the English, the French, the Northern Italians, they all had their different religious flavor because they had the freedom to be able to live that out. And so politics can be religious because God cares about all human life, and is intimately concerned with the smallest element of human life. But we mustn't then confuse politics as being preeminently human, because, at least in the Christian cosmology, honoring your father and mother is more fundamental than honoring the head of state.
Yeah, and this is something I kind of disagree with you here, because I think politics is really important. We can't poo-poo that. I mean, just to use a non-Western example, right? Who rules Japan, Tokugawa or Oda Nobunaga? I mean, if you're a Christian, I know I'm being anachronistic, because Oda Nobunaga died way before Tokugawa, like about 20 years before Tokugawa came on the scene. But they're fighting in the same war over who would rule Japan, and the consequence of Tokugawa winning was all the Christians got tortured to death and were either martyred, forced into apostasy, or were among a very small number that survived in secret. That is not something that Christians can just like go, okay, it's not important. But it's very important for politics to not enter into the temple. I think secularism is really to protect religion, because
Yes.
if the Catholic Church became simply an apologesia for the shogunate of the Oda clan, it would have died when the soul of Japan itself would have died when the shogunate fell.
Well, there's two bits. There's two bits to which you're right, and yet I don't know where we disagree necessarily. So the invention of the secular is a direct result of the church asserting her freedom against kings.
Yes.
Right?
And that's the more important part.
Yeah. So because the impulse of the human spirit throughout human history is to think that politics should subsume religion, but the whole point of Christianity is to say, no, 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 no. Faith in God is higher than that, but gives you the freedom to still live that. Now, it's providential maybe that you brought up Nobunaga and Tokugawa, because what I think about those, especially Tokugawa, but and also Nobunaga, like when his interaction with the Portuguese missionaries was very telling. You could see that he was more politically astute than they were. He knew there was going to be political implications for Christians preaching. And he knew the implications of the Christians preaching their religion in Japan more than the missionaries did, because the missionaries had built in, without knowing it, these distinctions between the temporal and the spiritual powers in a way that Japan had never seen before. So they looked at Christianity both with promise and with terror, because they knew that, oh, wait a second, if we let this religion in, who knows what's going to change? Mm-hmm. And they were smarter than they were more aware of the impact of the Christian message on Japan than the missionaries were, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I mean I think that in an ideal world, obviously, religion would subsume politics, but the problem is that there inevitably would be a backwash, and politics would consume religion and corrupt it.
But then it would also corrupt itself, right? Like this is what happens to a corrupt system, is that first it attacks its enemy, but then once it conquers its enemy, it consumes itself. So the moment, like one of the things that I'm noticing about a lot of the, I'll use Canada as an example. Right now, the churches in Canada are a scapegoat so that the political religion doesn't have to be held accountable. Mm-hmm. So like they'll look into the past and they'll say, "Oh, look at those evil things that the Catholic Church and the other Protestant churches did in the past." And it's like, well, wait. These were state-sponsored things too. Mm-hmm.
That confuses the narrative, right? Because the Canadian does not want to be on the line for racial harmony because it can't deliver it.
No, it can't deliver very much. Anyway, the point that I'm just trying to make is that I think that one of the reasons why I think that the world wants the church to appear more powerful than it actually is in the world, because then it can justify its own ideological positions. Like it needs the church to be strong. It's like Madonna. She can't be edgy unless she's going against the Catholicism of her youth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why Lady Gaga was always, I mean, other than being a worse musician too, I always felt that she was just so try hard.
Yeah,
because she's raging against this Puritanism that didn't exist, right? And you know, it's just so fake. I mean, Madonna was fake too, but it was at least a little bit believable, right? It was believable in the 80s that you could be rebelling against like austere Christianity. In 2016, though, I mean, come on.
There's no way that any modern person can say, "Oh yeah, that Catholic Church is a boogeyman that's preventing me from living my freedom." It's like, what are you talking about? You know, like, we can barely keep our parishes with electricity. Get over yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I think this is the last one, hopefully, because we're coming up on time here. Nerve AMV Maker, channel regular, thank you very much. Love Father's David observations on Tolkien and MacDonald in particular. I'd be interested on his thoughts on Flannery O'Connor. I find her views on God and faith to be the most unique and dark in Christian literature. Well, certainly 20th century literature, because I consider Flannery O'Connor to have a very medieval soul. Are you familiar with Flannery O'Connor?
Not a bit. Sorry to disappoint you.
Oh, you're not? Oh, wow. Well, I have a treat for you. You should. So she was this Southern Georgian writer who was Catholic, who wrote in the 60s And she wrote a bunch of short stories and 2 novels. And one of my favorite books of all time is Wise Blood. They all take place in the modern world, and they're all horrifically grotesque, and many of them are very, very violent. And there are sort of these medieval parables by which people under extreme delusion come in contact with reality in hard ways and have these incredibly bizarre revelations that are almost medieval in nature. And Flannery O'Connor was very Catholic herself and wrote a lot about her Catholicism and her Catholic beliefs in her short life. I think she died in her mid-30s from lupus, of all things. And yeah, it's a wonderful writer. I highly recommend her books. But yeah, she's the darkest Catholic author in the 20th century. But I think she's very par for the course when it comes to the medieval Catholic imagination. I mean,
I will readily admit that I've never been able to successfully read fiction. So even when I've read Tolkien, I had to psych myself out for about 2 months to prepare myself to read it. And I waited for a slow season in my job when I just had to be there, but I didn't do anything. So like I read the whole Lord of the Rings, like forcing myself to do it. George MacDonald's fairy tales I've read once and a half. Again, not particularly successfully. I'm just not good with stories, and I find history to be much more compelling. But the reason why I like MacDonald is and Tolkien is, and also Homer. I forced myself to listen to the Iliad as well. They get people in a way that distills history. So the problem with history is that there's so much data that it's hard to find the plot. And often the problem with fiction is that the plot is inhuman. And so those 3 people that I really like get both. But I still get tired and sleepy, and it's hard for me to read fiction. So that's just a personal limitation.
No, I would give O'Connor a chance, although if you're looking for understandable characters, you're not going to find it there, because her characters are like mutant medieval caricatures of humanity that slithered out of some weird age. They feel very well. Some of them are thoroughly modern, but some other ones are just, it's obviously very Southern, which is, Southern grotesque literature is more of a thing. But I'd highly recommend it. One of my favorite books of all times, if not my favorite, is Wise Blood, which is really, that's a harrowing book, and I highly recommend it. Well, Father, we are at the 2-hour mark, which is usually how long the streams go when I'm sort of interviewing / having a discussion with somebody. Did you have anything else you wanted to say or talk about before we ended it for tonight?
Be excellent to each other.
That sage wisdom. Yeah, from
George Carlin.
Oh yeah, I forgot that was George Carlin. The 80s were another country, man. The 80s were another country. No, I mean, I Keanu Reeves, surprisingly, had a long career as a movie actor, and surprisingly based person.
He's a good man.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, it's always hard to tell with actors, right? You always feel like you're not getting the right story or the full story.
True enough.
Well, but that being said, Father, thank you so much for coming on my stream. We could talk sometime in the future, hopefully. And I'll just say good night and God bless everyone.
God bless you all. See you soon.
Bye. All right.